أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على خير المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم سبحانك اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. So welcome back. We are now coming to the end of the sections that deal with buying and selling, or the chapter that's called Al-Buyu' and all of the other things that are similar to Buyu'. And we have got only a couple of areas left. Now, at the end of the last lesson, we were talking about musaqah and muzara'ah and the buying or selling of land. These are all things that are connected to agriculture, which was one of the main forms of wealth of most civilizations, probably up until the Industrial Revolution. And even since then, in fact, if you go look at America, a lot of the wealth of America is through these huge agricultural companies that fill the Midwest and grow lots of crops. So it's still a very, very important form of wealth, probably more so than animals in the modern era. Although, of course, we still have the huge cattle farms and sheep farms and the like. But although, predominantly it is what's called money in the modern world, that is most wealth, agriculture is still very important. And so even though the majority of people, because the problem is with agricultural now, that's changed from the past, is pretty much, every third person would have some income from growing things. Now it's just massive farmers who own all of the land, and then the people who make their income from it are simply workers and nothing else. So a lot of these types of contracts that we do would not apply. You wouldn't have people randomly going to buy some land, a small piece of land, and growing things. That's quite rare now. There are still people who do it, but it's quite rare. But we were talking about crops, and crops were often sold while they were still growing. This was a particular thing that was done, but only after they were at a stage where they were already viable. So basically, crops were allowed to be sold, specific crops, but only after they had reached the stage where their salah had become visible, where their ability to be used by this meaning by human beings. Of course, a lot of these crops, for example, barley, could be sold well before human beings could use it for animal fodder. So, if it is sold at that point and there is a use for it, then that is permitted as well, so long as the person harvests it immediately and doesn't actually just buy it pretending to get the crops for animals and then just leaves it on there because he got a special price until he takes it later, which would not be allowed, because then that's a gamble. That's a gharar. So it's one of the conditions. If you sell something before its salah has bada, before it has become viable and ripe, you have to harvest it immediately for that to be a valid transaction. But anyway, if you buy something and it's ripened, for example, dates you could buy from the moment they started to change color. So when they started to yellow with certain varieties, or they started to redden with other varieties, stopping being green. As soon as they started to do that, and they were now a viable thing, there were various stages that they could then be eaten. But you were allowed to buy them then. But there was still a little bit of time, a week or two sometimes, before they became what's called tamar, before they were dry or dried out on the branches. And when you pick them, they were now tamars. Like when you see with the North African dates that you get, you don't have to store them and wait for them to dry. They're edible as dates, as tamar, immediately after picking them. So this was one of the things. So people would buy them after they were viable, but they might still be what's called rutab, which is edible, but not in the date form that most of us know. They were much more juicy and succulent at that stage. But usually people would leave them until they reached the tamar stage before they would take them from the trees. So this is a week or two sometimes. In this period of time, something could happen. You could have hail, or you could have an army come through and smash down all the crops, or you could have a whole load of birds come and attack the crops and eat them all, or lots of various things that could happen. Or worms could develop in the trees because you had some rainfall and it left damp, which caused worms to appear and so on. There are loads of various things. So they could flood, or there could be there could be a wind, one of those desert winds that just devastates the crops. All of these various things. These are all what's called in Arabic ja'iha or jawa'ih. For want of a better word, blight. Although you wouldn't call all of these things blight in English. It's simply something that is outside of your control, like what they call an act of God, that comes along and destroys the crops. So the question here is, if you've bought crops on the tree, and then all or a part of those crops are destroyed by these blights before you've reached the stage where you can actually harvest them during that week or whatever it is, what happens to the price that you've paid or the price that you agreed? Because you might be getting a lot less than you expected to get. So this is the question that he's talking about here. There's a whole ruling depending upon what it is. So he says here, وَمَنْ ابْتَاعَ ثَمْرَةً, if somebody buys a fruit, by which he's talking about dates and grapes, and also in addition to that, walnuts and other types of nuts, that particular type of fruit. فِي رُؤُوسِ الشَّجَرِ, and the fruit is still on the branches of the tree, still growing on the tree. فَأُجِيحَ, then these crops are devastated or destroyed by barad, which is hail, or jarad, which is frost, or jalid, which is ice and snow and things like that, or ghayrihi, or anything else. Oh, sorry, jalid is frost, jarad is locusts, which was one of the. I remember going to Morocco and going to visit some people in the countryside, and the whole field looked sort of multicolored. They had these sort of greens and blues, shimmering colors everywhere. I was wondering, wow, that's quite amazing looking. And they said, it's not good for us. Those are locusts. And they were everywhere. They're quite sort of amazing looking creatures. I think a lot of people would eat the locusts, in fact. Yeah. Yeah. Or ghayrihi, or anything else. So I mentioned all of these various different types of things, flooding or biting winds or armies coming through or anything else of that nature. I mean, you can see in Gaza, bombs being dropped on the fields and destroying the entire field. Somebody might have just bought that from somebody else. What happens? So he says here, فَإِنْ أُجِيحَ قَدْرُ الثُّلُثِ فَأَكْثَرُ, if more than a third of the crops, there's two things that you have to take into account here. There's the value of the crops and the amount of the crops. Both of these things have to reach a third. Well, actually, the main one here that has to be is the amount of it. So if the amount of the crops is a third that's been destroyed, then you look at what the value of those crops would be at the particular time that they would have been harvested. And that's the amount then that you would remove from the price that is paid. So he says here, فَإِنْ أُجِيحَ قَدْرُ الثُّلُثِ فَأَكْثَرُ, if more than a third of the crops are destroyed by this thing that happened, وُضِعَ عَنِ الْمُشْتَرَى قَدْرُ ذَلِكَ مِنَ الثَّمَنِ, the amount, that percentage of the price is removed from the buyer. Again, he's talking about the value here. So the amount has to be a third, but then you look into the value of that third, because, for example, the early crop, the first ones that are taken might have a particular value because not many dates are around then, so people might pay a premium. And the ones that are then taken in the midst of when everybody is harvesting would have a different value. And the ones taken at the end when, again, not many people might be harvesting might, again, have more of a value. So you actually have to take into account the value as well as the amount. The amount has to be a third or more. If it's less than a third, no matter if the value is 90% of the crop, no, you don't get any reduction. So it's about the amount of crop that's destroyed, and then you look at the value. And then you take that value away from the price. So, for example, if I paid you 100 dinars for the crop on your tree, and then it got destroyed, say half of that crop got destroyed, and that half was worth half the value, then you have to give me back 50 dinars. The seller has to give 50 dinars back. Or if I haven't paid it yet, it was a delayed payment, I would then give you 50 dinars. Is that clear?
So if it's less than a third, you just no reduction.
No reduction. It's just considered to be one of the things that happens, one of the risks of life.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's more than a third, it's considered to be, significant, and it affects whether people will do such transactions. Because if there was that, I mean, these things are tend to be fairly rare. So this might be 1 in every 10 years, if that. So I mean, but you wouldn't expect something like this to happen. But if it was like pure risk that especially if you're buying these things and you might lose everything as the buyer, then وَمَا نَقَصَ عَنِ الثُّلُث فَمِنَ الْمُبْتَعِ. If it is less than a third, the buyer has to shoulder the loss. وَلَا جَائِحَةَ فِي الزَّرْعِ. That's for trees that have fruit. When those trees are sold, when the fruit first becomes ripe. Sometimes it's still on the tree and it's sold after the fruit has reached the stage where it's already dry and ready to use as a tamar. And sometimes what is being sold is grain. And grain is not allowed to be sold until the grain on the stalk is dry and ready to be used. You're not allowed to sell it at any point before then. So he says here, if it is zara, and if it is trees that have already dried, the fruit is already dried on the tree, la ja'iha. There is no ruling regarding blight here. In other words, it's all on the buyer. There's no third, no half, nothing here. Basically, once you've bought it, it's on you then to go and harvest it. If you delay for a bit and something happens, you're culpable. You're responsible. All the loss is on you. Whereas in the other case, you have to wait a bit before it reaches the stage where most people would harvest it. Now here, if you're not harvesting it immediately, that's your fault because it's ready to harvest the moment you buy it. So all of the culpability is on you. The seller should not have to shoulder any of the possibility of loss here. It transfers the ownership the moment it is sold, in this case, fully transfers to the buyer. And it's considered that possession has transferred to him as well. So he says, وَلَا جَائِحَةَ. There is no rulings of this sort regarding blight. When it comes to zara, which refers to grain, وَلَا فِي مَشْتَرَى بَعْدَ أَنْ يَيْبِسَ مِنَ الثِّمَارِ. And nor what is bought, وَلَا فِي مَشْتُرِيَ, nor what is bought after the fruit has dried on the tree. So, I mean, this drying on the tree, obviously, it wouldn't apply to things like apples and things like that because they don't. It just applies to things like dates and nuts, pretty much. وَتُوضَعُ جَائِحَةُ الْبُقُولِ وَإِنْ قَلَّتْ. And there's another type of crop here, which is vegetables. This refers especially to those vegetables that have green on the top, but the vegetable is hidden underneath. Things like carrots, potatoes, all those other ones that you see a growth on the top, but you can't actually see the plant underneath. So there's a different ruling with regard to these. Because usually, obviously, when you buy them, they're assumed to be already ready. So again, you would be buying them and then picking them immediately. So he says here, with regard to this type of crop, it's not something where there's any particular known delay period. So they're very similar to grain. There is no, but here again, because of the fact that you can't see them, they are not the same as grain because you don't know what is underneath. So he says here, with respect to these, even though in some ways they are similar to one, in some ways similar to the other, they have their own special category here. So basically, all of the loss is on the seller with these, even if only a little bit of them is destroyed, because it's something that's not seen at the moment of purchase. So he says here, وَتُوضَعُ جَائِحَةُ الْبُقُولِ وَإِنْ قَلَّتْ. Even if a small amount of vegetable harvest is destroyed, even if it's like a single potato plant from 100 potato plants, you then pay for, and that destroys, say, a hundredth of the crop, your price is reduced by 100th. That's the strongest position. He says here, وَقِيلَ لَا يُوضَعُ إِلَّا قَدْرُ الثُّلُث. But it's also said that it's the same as dates and things like that, that you only have a reduction in the price that you pay if a third or more is destroyed. So, I mean, it's just going through the various different categories of things, and they all had their special categories. These were the main things that people subsisted on. Grain and dates were the main subsistence crops, and vegetables were the main thing that accompanied meat and other dishes that people ate. They were all vital. So that's Ja'iha. Are there any questions regarding that? It's quite simple, really. You just have to know what type of crop you have, and then work out the amount that's destroyed, work out the value of that, and then your price that you agreed or paid is reduced as a result, depending upon these various factors. Then we have something which is called an ariya, which is a type of gift. So people sometimes, instead of giving them money or giving them dates, would give them the crop of trees, a certain number of trees. So, you know, you might say, you see that orchard over there, those 5 trees in that orchard, whatever crops they give, they are yours. This was a type of gift that people did in the past. He says, وَمَنْ أَعْرَى ثَمَرَ نَخَلَاتٍ. If somebody gives the fruit of various different palm trees, لِرَجُلٍ مِنْ جِنَانِ, to a man, and those trees that he's giving the fruit belong to him. They are part of the trees that belong to him. Obviously, you can't say, you see those 5 trees that belong to so-and-so. Whatever fruit they give, I will give to you. I mean, you would think, you could say then he could go and buy them when it comes, but there's too much doubt in terms of what he's giving there. So it's something that has to belong to you. And يَشْتَرِيَهَا فَلَا بَأْسَ أَنْ يَشْتَرِيَهَا. So they used to do this. They would give the fruit of these trees. But obviously, once you've given the fruit of trees, there's a bit of work that needs to be done in order to get those fruit. And, you know, the person you've given it to may not have the capacity or the willpower to be able to do that work. So sometimes they would then buy back the gift from them in order to do them a good turn. So you would give them the fruit of those trees. Then you would go to these trees at the time when they had ripened, and you would get somebody with this skill of what's called khirs, which is you estimate the total volume of crop on those trees. And then, because then you basically give the person those dates. So he doesn't have to do any of the work. Now you are now in charge of the trees. You have to then harvest it. Mm-hmm. So you work out, say you work out that there's 100 kilos of tamar on the trees. Then you give him, or 100 liters of tamar. The moment you do the harvesting, you give him those 100 liters. He doesn't have to do any of the work. Otherwise, he would have to do the work and get it himself. So you've bought that from him and taken on the work for yourself and guaranteed that he's going to get all of the crop that you gave him. So it's basically a second good turn, really, because you're not really getting anything extra out of it for yourself. So this was one of the things that people used to do. And sometimes, obviously, you would pick the dates a little bit early, so then they would have to then go into a place where they would dry out for a bit. So that estimation would have to be taken into account. But again, the person now would not have to wait. The person you gave the fruit of the trees to wouldn't have to wait for his, because the moment you harvested them, you're allowed to then give him the payment, which is the same. And this is one of the cases that is an exclusion from not being allowed to buy something known with something unknown. Because although you are giving him the same amount, it's an estimation. even though somebody's very, very skilled at estimating. And that goes against what's called muzabana. It's exactly what the Messenger of Allah forbade from muzabana, but it's allowed in this particular circumstance in order to make things easier for the beneficiaries. So, I mean, obviously, this is something that none of us will ever probably do, because I don't know how many of us here own our own date palms or even our own fruit trees. But it was because you can do this for any fruit tree. But it was one of the ways of being generous, and then one of the ways of doubling down on that generosity. So he says it's permitted, فَلَا بَأْسَ, there's no harm, in يَشْتَرِيَهَا, the owner of those trees, buying back the fruit, إِذَا أَزْهَتْ, so long as they have reached their stage where they are ripe. So he would buy back those things. They are still on the tree. They are still maybe in the rutab stage. He would do بِخِرْسِهَا tamran, working out how much tamr those dates on the trees are. This was quite a skill, because if you look at dates, you look at the size of a tamr, and you look at the size of a rutab date. The rutab date is quite a lot bigger. So because once it dries, obviously a lot of that moisture and liquid inside the date leaves. So it's actually quite a skill to know how much crop is on a particular tree. بِخِرْسِهَا تَمْرًا يُعْتِيهِ ذَلِكَ عِنْدَ الْجُذَاذِ, and he gives him those tamr. So he tells him, look, I'm going to give you 100 liters of tamr in exchange for the dates on the trees that I gave you. And the guy says, okay, fine. But he doesn't give him now immediately. He only gives him when he does the judad, which is the harvesting, the cutting of the various different dates from the tree, which avoids food now for food later. إن كان فيها 5 أوسق فأقل, so long as the amount of dates on those trees is 5 wasaqs or less. Why does he say this particular amount? This was the amount that zakat became due on. So when you have a crop, the moment you reach 5 wasaq, which is about 600 liters in modern amounts, that is the time that you have to then pay a 10th or a 20th, depending upon whether they are watered or not, of that crop. So he's saying one of the conditions here of being able to buy them is that the amount in that crop is less than the zakatable amount. Because then it brings in sort of the other thing of then you're taking the crop off the tree, and the moment you take it off, if it's more than that, you have to then pay the zakat on it. So what about the dates that you already had? They've already been zakated a long time ago, so it throws in other issues. So he says here, so long as the total amount in those trees is less than the zakatable amount, or just is not more than that. ولا يجوز شراء أكثر من 5 أوسق. It is not permitted for the owner to buy more than that 5 أوسق, 600 liters, إلا بالعين والعرض, except if he buys it with money or with something else other than fruit or food. So he can't buy that with dates then. Yes, he could buy it from him. He could go to him and say, look, you see the dates on the tree that I gave you? I will buy those dates from you for 100 dinars. That's perfectly fine, no matter how many dates there are. So long as they both agree, that's a perfectly fine transaction, because you're buying them after they are already ripe, which is permitted on the tree. But to buy it with the same fruit or with other types of food brings in all things that are not permitted. For example, if you buy it with other food, it's not hand to hand.
The different variations of dates.
No, it should be the same variation of date and the same quality, if at all possible. It's not allowed to be even with different varieties of date, because it brings in other issues that bring in riba and all those other types of things. So this is just a specific thing, because it was an easy form of gift that people used to do. They would have a huge orchard. They would think, oh, wow, yeah, so-and-so is in need, have the fruit of that. And then they would often then later think, well, I've got people who are working the whole orchard. they might as well take do the work for this guy. I mean, I suppose you could do the work for him and then the guy would wait. But often they would just say, no, I'll give you the same amount of dates that were going to come off those trees. It was just one of the ways that it was done. Bab fil wasaya. So that's the end of that chapter. Are there any questions regarding that? I mean, it's been going on for a while. Buying and selling. I mean, there are lots of other things that relate to that you have to go into a particular topic in depth in order to deal with. In fact, in order to understand these things properly, we have to engage in these transactions and see what is easy to understand when you're engaging them and what sort of you realize when you're doing it is not so clear. So a lot of these things we have to actually start forming these contracts between ourselves. So this next chapter relates to basically things that people used to do in order to draw near to Allah. So things that were given or were done in order to please Allah solely. Also, they could be something in it for human beings as well. But generally speaking, the first one, like a wasiyah, which we translate as a bequest, which is when you write a will, basically. You write a will and you leave somebody something. You're under no obligation to do that. So it's like a form of gift, basically. It's not like fara'id, which is the shares of inheritance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran. That is, you're not giving it. It ceases to be yours the moment you die. And that your estate now belongs to other people. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in his wisdom and in his generosity to us, even after our death, allows us a certain leeway with things that had been in our possession, which is in the form of wasiyah, which has a similar meaning to wasala, because it connects the actions that you were able to do in your disposal of property before death with what you can do after death. So you can't do that with all your wealth. You can do that with only up to a third of your wealth. This is just known as the third generally. And the reason it's a third is from an occasion when the Messenger of Allah was visiting Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, and Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu was very ill, and he was worried that he was going to die. And so he asked the Messenger of Allah's permission to give all of his wealth for sadaqah and, to orphans, all these various things. And the Messenger of Allah said no. And then he asked again, and he asked about a third, because it was denying his daughters. Sa'ad ibn Waqqas had children. And so the Messenger of Allah, when he said a third, he said yes, but even that's a lot. So, I mean, it shows that you're allowed to have disposal over a third, but even that is as much as you should even ever think of. But it's still, even so, despite that, it's a recommended thing in the deen, because you're helping give sadaqah to people who would not otherwise get sadaqah. And you're allowed to do that. By the way, if you are ill in your final illness and you give things away now, or create waqfs now, or whatever, and you are very, very ill, that it's feared that you might die from that illness, then you're limited to a third of your total wealth as well. And if you do that, then you die, there's no space left for any wasiyah if that completely ate up the third. Because that's, in that moment, your wealth is partially yours, but it's partially the people who are coming after you. So there's a difference. There's also another difference between a wasiyah, which is something that you leave upon your death, which the way you do a wasiyah is you get witnesses. Basically, if I'm going to leave something to somebody after my death, I have to do ishhad. I have to get 2 male witnesses who are trustworthy, or 1 male witness and 2 female witnesses, because this is mal, and make this wasiyah in their presence. If I write something down, like with a lot of people in modern wills today, and I just put it in a book or something, and then somebody finds it, and I've written, I want so-and-so to get this, and I want so-and-so, that doesn't count. Except if before you die, you get witnesses and say, look, I wrote something down, I want you to witness that I want implemented exactly what I wrote down in my handwriting. Then that's different. Yeah, then even if he hadn't specified exactly those things before the witnesses, that's considered to be enough. But anyway, this is a wasiyah. The difference between it and a gift is that you're not allowed to take back a gift. Or if you create a waqf, you're not allowed to take back that waqf. But if I say I'm going to leave £100 to so-and-so, and then I change my mind, I can take it back. So it's a form of gift, but it's a gift that can be taken back. So it's slightly different from other forms of gifts. He says, Bab fil wasaya wal mudabbar wal mukatab wal mu'taq. And he mentions here a number of ways in which slaves are freed. And he's going to go into the ways that this is done. Again, this is one of the ways of drawing near to Allah. Freeing a slave is one of the most encouraged acts, but there were various different ways that could happen. Wa ummul walad. And then finally he mentions what's called wala, which is basically the connection. I think they often translate it as like patronship or something like that. It's the connection that a person has with the person to whom he gives freedom. And this connection was one whereby if that person dies without leaving any heirs, you become his inheritor. There was also a more general wala, which was when people became Muslim from who didn't have Muslim family. They again entered into that general wala where all of their possessions would then be inherited by the Muslims as a whole when they died, unless they developed heirs after becoming Muslim. Often, if you look in the books of fiqh, it wasn't accepted that any connections they claimed predated Islam, these connections were not always accepted unless they were known about and had people to witness them. Two people could become Muslim and they could say, no, we're brothers, because they have a great love for each other, but they're actually not. So the deen, to protect against that with this general wala of becoming Muslim, would say, no, that's not accepted. Not unless in their land there were Muslim prisoners, for example, who came back and said, yeah, they are actually brothers. But if a Muslims come to a land and everybody there becomes Muslim, then whatever they claim of their connections before Islam is accepted. It's considered to be different, because then it's generally known about in society. But if a few small group of people come to the lands of Islam and claim family connections to each other, that's not generally accepted. And this is obviously something that maybe does not apply so much in the modern era, where these things are detailed and paperwork is provided for all of these things. But this was obviously a problem that happened in the past. وَيَحِقُّ عَلَى مَنْ لَهُ مَا يُوصَى فِيهِ. So if somebody has wealth enough to leave a wasiyah, then it is, he says here, it is a right upon him. In other words, something that he should do. I mean, it's actually strong. It's not obligatory, even though he was yahiqqu ala, you might think means obligatory. He says, no, it's strongly recommended, a wasiyah, because it's a form of sadaqah. And all types of sadaqah are recommended in the deen. And yu'idda wasiyatah, that he prepares or has witnessed a wasiyah. By the way, there are two types of wasiyah. This Arabic word, sometimes you might get confused looking in the books of fiqh when you see it. Now, wasiyah sometimes refers to a financial amount or property that is left to somebody. That's the term wasiyah. But this wasiyah is also used to appoint somebody to a particular role or capacity. So we might call that an executor in English. So if somebody is made the wasi in general terms of somebody who dies, that person then takes on all of the responsibilities that the deceased had with respect to that deceased's dependents. Not his wife, obviously, but but his children. So he becomes the person who's financially, who uses the money on their behalf financially, or who marries them when they need to get married and things like this. So that was the other form of wasiyah. They were both. Sometimes the wasiyah could be specific. You could make a wasiyah to somebody to go on Hajj for you, or a wasiyah for somebody to carry out a particular task on your behalf. And these are all various forms of wasiyah. But most of the time when we talk about a wasiyah, we're talking about a sum of money or a bit of property that's left to somebody. And sometimes the wasiyah took the form of the freeing of a slave. So you might say, I bequeath, or I make a wasiyah that this particular slave of mine is set free upon my death. There are two types of ways of doing this. There's this, which is called a wasiyah of freeing a slave. And then there's the other one, which is called tadbir, that we're going to come into, which is where I say to the slave before witnesses, you are free when I die. That second one is considered to be much stronger than the wasiyah, because a wasiyah can be taken back, whereas that one cannot be taken back. It is now binding. So it's two different types of contract.
Yeah.
It's called tadbir, which is basically when you tell a slave that he is free after your death. In front of witnesses, otherwise, how is it proved? I mean, obviously it counts even without witnesses, but how is it proved? So then it's ignored. Yeah. وَلَا وَصِيَّةَ لِوَارِثٍ. This is another very important thing. So you can leave up to a third of your money in these wasiyas, but you cannot make a wasiyah to somebody who is already an inheritor, somebody who already has a set share of the inheritance, unless all of the heirs, without exception, agree. That's the only time that it's allowed generally. So basically, and similar, by the way, there's no wasiyah above a third as well, except if all of the heirs agree. So all of the heirs agreeing to something allows it, even though generally speaking, it's not usually allowed. But if somebody already is getting a share of the inheritance, let's say like a son or a daughter, or a father or a mother or a grandfather, they cannot then also be given a wasiyah in the will. So if they're going to get a third of the money left over after the wasiyahs, and then I say, and I also want him to get £1,000, that doesn't count. It's not allowed. You're not allowed to do that. You can't give somebody who already has a share and a further share on top of that share. It's an important point that people should be aware of. So this thing of being allowed to give away, make a will that you dispose of your money exactly as you want is not allowed according to the deen. But if somebody is connected to somebody else who has say for example, I've got two sons, and one of those sons has a child of his own. I'm allowed to leave a wasiyah to that child of that son, because that child of that son is not going to inherit. He's blocked by his father. So even if somebody is part of the dependent group of somebody else, you can leave a wasiyah to them. But you couldn't, for example, leave it to the slave of that person, because as we're going to come to, the property of a slave belongs to the slave, but still the owner has a right to take it away if he decides to. So then that could be a way that you find a way around not leaving a wasiyah to an heir. So there are all these things you have to be very, very careful on. But that's one of the main conditions of this. وَالْوَصَايَا خَارِجَةٌ مِّنَ الثُّلُثِ. These wasiyahs must be taken from the third and no more. وَيُرَدُّ مَا زَادَ عَلَيْهِ. But anything that's above a third is revoked and cancelled and not allowed. إِلَّا أَنْ يُجِيزُهُ الْوَرَثَةِ. Except if all of the heirs accept it, all of them. Although, let's say, for example, you have a situation where you have two brothers and their father dies and they both inherit 50-50, and this father left half of his wealth before them in wasiyas. Then one of the brothers says, yes, I accept. It's fine. I don't mind the extra bit being left. And the other brother says no. Then actually some of that is taken from the portion of the brother who agreed. So this instead of the people who had the wasiyas being able to get up to a half, they would then get the third, then half of the remaining third on top of that. And that would be removed from the share of the inheritance that that brother who agreed accepted. So then they could then get so a half, a sixth, a half of a sixth, a twelfth on top of the third that they were allowed. So what that would then be 5/12 would be allowed to go to them. And that one brother who would now have got a third himself in total would have that 12th removed from his portion. Because obviously he gets a half, but he only gets a half after that third is removed. وَالْعِتْقُ, so that's with regard to wasiyah. And also the amount of the wasiyah, the third, is worked out as the amount of wealth that a person is known to have at the time of his death. If a person is known, or he thought, and everybody thinks that he has a certain amount of wealth, then suddenly it turns up that he had another whole load of wealth that nobody had realized appears. That's not considered to be part of it. That goes only to the heirs. The third is not worked out with regard to that extra amount. It's only the amount that he was known to have at the time of his death. Unless, of course, everybody knew they were waiting on news, then that would be different. Well, itqu, now we go on to freeing of slaves. Well, itqu bi'aynihi mubta. So basically, this is still in wasiyah. So, as I said, some of the forms of wasiyah were freeing of slaves. Now, generally speaking, when it comes to wasiyahs, there is an order of precedence. In other words, you can use up to a third of your wealth, but sometimes you've given so many wasiyahs away that it eats up the entirety of the third and more. So how do you work out that all of these people who've got wasiyahs, who gets given what? That's the question here. So he says here, well, there are wasiyahs that are all of the same level. And that's basically amounts, financial amounts. If I say I'm giving £100 to so-and-so, I'm giving my car to so-and-so, I'm giving my horse to so-and-so, whatever. All of those are financial amounts. They're all at one level. So there's other things, by the way. So when a person dies, the first thing that is looked at is his funeral costs and debts. And sometimes the debts will take away everything. All of his wealth could be taken away by his debts. Then, once all of these debts are paid, then you look at what's left. That is now his estate. That is the estate that you take to work out everything else. From that amount that's left, after all the debts and stuff have been paid, and this would include zakat as a debt that if he's known to owe the zakat and he acknowledged the zakat before witnesses and the amounts, that can be considered to be a debt. But we're going to come to, there are other things with zakat where he might have made a wasiyah for his zakat to be paid, but he didn't actually acknowledge the exact amount and things like that. So those are debts. Then after the debts, your wealth is divided up into thirds. 1/3 is for your wasiyahs. Now somebody could die and he could, as I said, leave a lot more than 1/3 of his remaining wealth. He might have not taken into account all the debts, for example. But that third is the maximum. So let's say all of the wasiyahs that he left eat up all of his money. Everybody's share, if it's simply financial wasiyahs, is divided by 3. So they get 1/3 of what they would otherwise get, because it can only be 1/3. So if I left 100 dinars, and I left wasiyahs for 100 dinars to various people, say I left 33 to this one, 30 to this one, 30 to that one, 30 to that one, and 10 to that one, eating up all of my money. Because they're only allowed 1/3, everyone's portion is divided by 1/3. So that one, instead of getting 30, gets 10. That one, instead of getting 10, gets 3 3/4 to 3 1/3, and so on. But there are other things that are taken out of the wasiyah before any of this can be done. So let's say, for example, while I'm alive, I do this thing of freeing a slave in my wasiyah. I say, so-and-so, it might be my own slave. I say, so Ahmed, who's been with me for 30 years, I give him my freedom, I bequeath him my freedom in my will. Yeah? That's his freeing would take precedence over all of the other ones. So say his value as a slave was 33 1/3 dinars. He would be freed, and then everybody else who'd been left financial amounts will get nothing, because the 1/3 of my estate had already gone. So that takes precedence. So there's a whole list of things that take precedence over other things. The main one being the mudabbar, that we're going to come to, the slave who you promise freedom to. I go to him and say, look, you are going to be free on my death. It's not the same as a wasiyah, as I said. That one, he takes precedence over everything. So if I have two slaves, Ahmed and Zayd, I say to Ahmed, you will be free on my death. And I do this as a tadbir. And then I say to Zayd, I'm writing a bequest that you will be free upon my death. Yeah. When I die, if the value of Ahmed and the value of Zayd are roughly the same, and they both each on its own comes to about a third of the value of my estate, then Ahmed is freed and Zayd is not. Because Ahmed used up the entirety of the third. Because he takes precedence. So there's a whole list of who takes precedence.
You have to value the slaves within the will as well.
No, that valuation is a process that's done by people who understand how the value of things. So I mean, they may not all be worth the same amount, but
one saying that, for example, you're going to free a slave. Does it have to be because of everything of the estate is valued in money terms?
Yeah, it's all valued in dinars and dirhams or dinars.
And so the slave is also valued in the same way?
Yeah, the slave is valued. Yeah, he's assigned a value.
Oh.
Everything is assigned a value that you leave, basically, in order to work. How else would you divide up inheritance? Say you leave a house and you leave a library of books and you leave a bunch of slaves and you leave a bunch of animals and a bunch of crops. How are you going to work out who gets what?
I was assuming that slave is like a person that you just say you're free and that's it. It doesn't really take time.
Well, no, because by freeing the slave after your death, you are dealing with property that belonged to you at the moment of your death. And when property belongs to you at the moment of your death, it transfers at the moment of your death to your heirs. And you're trying to do something with it after your death. So that means the deen gives you a certain allowance, as we've been talking about, to deal with a third of your property after your death, but no more. So then you have to work out the value of that slave, because otherwise the heirs, that might be your entire property. You die, you spent your entire life savings on slaves, and then you die, and then your heirs only have your slaves, and you've said in your will that they're all free. So what are the heirs going to get? So when that happens in those particular circumstances, sometimes they do the thing where each slave will have a third of the slave freed. So they would, a third of their time would then be their own, or they would do it by lots, where the slave who draws the lot is the one who's freed. In those sorts of circumstances. So he says, well, itqu bi aynihi, when you free a specific slave in your wasiyah, mubadda'un alayha, it takes precedence. That takes precedence. Wal mudabbaru fi sihhati mubadda. But again, that's not the thing that takes ultimate precedence. If you do a tadbir of a slave, telling a slave directly in front of witnesses that he is free after your death, and you do that while you are in the fullness of your health, before you've entered your final illness, then that takes precedence. He says here that also takes precedence ala ma fil marad. If you do that, any type of freeing of a slave while you are in your final sickness, min itqin wa ghayrihi. So even if you free a slave on the spot while you are ill, if you did tadbir of a slave before that, so this is a situation where a man is healthy, and then he's got two slaves, Ahmed and Zayd. He goes to Ahmed and he says, you will be free upon my death. Then the next week he falls ill. And while he's ill, he summons Zayd and says, you're free, Zayd. Right now, you're free. Which takes precedence here? Ahmed, because even though he was promised the death after, he was promised his freedom after the death, when you are in your final illness, whatever you do is considered to be tantamount to you doing it after your death. So he's saying here, the freeing of Ahmed in this particular circumstance, with the tadbir, takes precedence even over a direct freeing or any other type of freeing when you are in your final illness. Obviously, if you recover from that illness, then that's a different matter. if you recover from that illness, then obviously your direct freeing counts. And and Ahmed will have to wait until your death, but the other guy's free now. وعلى ما فرط فيه من الزكاة. So as I said, when it comes to zakat, you can make a wasiyah that your zakat, any zakat that you have fallen short in paying, is paid on your behalf. Yeah. If you do that, then your heirs have to pay it, but it is paid from the third unless it's known specifically. It's an amount that's mentioned before witnesses that is known. The reason why it's taken from the wasiyah is because there's always circumstances where you could have made a wasiyah of that and then paid it anyway. So it has to be mentioned in the wasiyah, and then it's only taken from the third. If it's not mentioned in the wasiyah, if he simply says it to one person but doesn't make a wasiyah of it, then the heirs do not actually have to pay it, unless it's known for a fact that it was zakat that was owed, because there's always a possibility that they could have been paid. So you want to avoid things being paid more than they otherwise need to. So there's a list of the whole thing. So the guy goes in the sharh, goes through the various lists here that take precedence when you make a wasiyah. The first thing is the thing that takes ultimate precedence is if you in your wasiyah say, I want so and so's ransom to be paid and him to be freed from the enemy. That takes precedence first. Then he says here, this tadbir I've been talking about is number 2. Then he says here, if you marry somebody in your final sickness, the dowry that is owed to that woman is taken from the third as well, and it takes precedence over other things that you might then say. This outstanding zakat is at position number 4 that you've mentioned in your wasiyah. Position 5 is zakat al-fitr. That you owe. The 6th is freeing of slaves due to a kafara, that is for something like vihar, when a man basically compares his wife to his mother, or the back of his mother, literally. In other words, saying she's haram for him without directly saying that. In order to make her halal for you again, I think we mentioned this back in the section on marriage, he has to pay a kafara. And that kafara, the freeing of a slave, is one of the main ways of doing that. So that, in an order of precedence, becomes the next one in this list. And then there's the kafara of breaking an oath. The freeing of the slave for that, again, takes precedence over the other wasiyahs, because these are things that a person has to do. Then the kafara of eating in Ramadan, the freeing a slave for that, takes the next one. All of these are before the financial wasiyahs that you leave. Then freeing a slave and fulfillment of a vow. If you say, if I do such and such, then a slave is free. And you do that thing, and then you die before the slave is freed. That then comes from your wasiyah, and it takes precedence over other things. Then slaves freed while in your final illness. So they're quite a long way down the list. If I say to someone, when I'm dying, you're free, that's at this point. But again, it's before financial wasiyahs. Then a bequest, a wasiyah to free a specific slave. So we have the order of freeing slaves here. There's the tadbir. Ignore all the kafara ones. The tadbir, when I say to a slave, you are free on my death. Well, I say this to him while I'm healthy. Then number 2, if I fall ill and then summon a slave and say, you're free now. That's number 2 on the list of priority of these freeing slaves. Then number 3, I write a will saying, I want so-and-so to be freed in my will. That's after all of these ones. Then a bequest to make a slave a mukataba, which is something else, a mukatab. And then non-specific freeing. If you simply say in your wasiyah, I want a slave to be freed from my slaves. That comes next. So these are all specific slaves up to this point. And then if you make a wasiyah for somebody to do hajj on your behalf, that comes next. And then all of the bequests. So there's lots of things that come before I leave so-and-so 100 quid can come into it, basically. Obviously, a lot of these things, when you make a will, you might simply make the financial ones and not mention. In the modern era, you're not going to be freeing many slaves, because I don't think, apart from Mauritania, very many people own slaves. I've heard so. Allahu Alam. No? I heard fairly recently. Maybe in the countryside. It's gone. That's finished. So basically now we're just talking about Hajj, really, of all of these things. If you make a bequest for somebody to do Hajj and you make financial bequests, if the cost of the guy going on Hajj on your behalf eats up the third, then those other guys won't get anything. That's basically in the modern era. وَإِذَا ضَاقَ الثُّلُث, if the third is too small, there's not enough, not big enough, there's not enough money in that third to cover everything. تَحَاصَى أَهْلُ الْوَصَايَا الَّتِي لَا تَبْدِئَةَ فِيهَا. All of those people who have bequests that are not part of this list of priorities, in other words, financial bequests, they get a share. They get a settlement with a share that's proportional to the amount that they would have got. So for example, if, as I said before, if somebody left bequests for 100, and then in fact it turns out his total wealth was only 100, and in that 100 he left one person 50 and somebody else 50, each of those people, instead of getting 50 each, will now get 17 2/3 each, because they have to fit within the third. Not really. It just means that everything, it's like your debts. If you die, or if you become insolvent and you owe $1 million in debt, and once all of your assets are sold, that only brings 100,000. Those creditors, they will have to get a tenth of the amount they would have otherwise got, each of them.
Like bankruptcy, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you bankrupt.
Basically, you don't say one of them gets his full amount and the rest get nothing. Each of them gets his amount cut by the same amount. And it's the same here with these guys. Each of them gets their amount cut by the same amount. وَلِلرَّجُلِ الرُّجُوعُ عَنْ وَصِيَّتِهِ. A man is allowed to take back or revoke his wasiyah مِنْ عِتْقٍ وَغَيْرِهِ, whether he's freed somebody in his will or done anything else. So if I say I make a wasiyah that so-and-so will be freed upon my death, and then I change my mind a week later and say, no, okay, I'm taking that back, he's not going to be. And even if I'm in my final illness, I'm still allowed to impact the third, so I can take that back. There's no harm. Or if I say I'm going to give so-and-so 5,000, and then I change my mind and say, I don't actually like him, no, I'm not giving him anything. Then I can take that back. That's fine. But the other one, tadbir, you cannot take back. Once you've agreed it, it's done. Just like gifts, you can't take back. So if you're giving something to somebody, it's like vomiting back in your own mouth or however you can't take that back. But as I said, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, in your final illness, gifts are considered to be the same as wasiyas in everything, apart from the fact that you're not allowed to take them back. They're counted as being part of the third, but you can't take a gift back. So if you freed this slave in your final illness, said you're free now, that's considered like a gift. If your third is enough to meet that at the time that you die, because his freeing does not happen immediately, because it's considered to be part of the third. It waits until the moment that you die. If that's not something you can then take back, though. If I said to him, you're free, and then a week later said, no, actually, no, it's too late. You can't take that one back. وَالتَّدْبِيرُ أَنْ يَقُولَ الرَّجُلُ. So what is tadbir? He says here, tadbir is for a person to say to his slave, أَنْ يَقُولَ الرَّجُلُ لِعَبْدِهِ, Anta mudabbar, you are mudabbar, using this term. Or anta hurrun and dubur, you are free after me. Dubur is like a back or something like that, but you apply something that comes after something else. So, for example, the dhikr that we do after each prayer, subhanallah, subhanallah, alhamdulillah, all of these things are called the dubur, things that you do dubur as-salah, after the prayer, the things that are done after the prayer. So this particular was the wording, but it might simply anything else that is understood or implied to have that meaning. If I simply say to him, I don't use these words, I simply say, the moment I die, you're free. That counts. ثُمَّ لَا يَجُوزُ لَهُ بَيْعُهُ. So once you've done that to a person, how does this affect what you are allowed to do with this slave of yours? He's still your slave at this moment, because you haven't said you're free now. You've said you're free when I die. So he's still your slave, but are there now any limitations or restrictions on what you can do with him? He says, yes. It is no longer permitted for you to sell him. You're not allowed to sell or give away or transfer the ownership of anybody you've made mudabbar, because the new owner then, what is he getting? He doesn't, this slave is only free and is only a slave until the moment you die. What if you die the next day? He's paid all this money for this slave and then you die the next day. So it's not permitted. It's too much gharar in such a transaction. وَلَهُ خِدْمَتُهُ, but you are allowed to make use of him, or indeed make use of his services by renting out his services to somebody else, until the moment that you die. So, but if you die, for example, say you rent out his services to somebody else to work on his farm for a month or be a tailor for him for a year, and then you die 1 month into the year. Does that guy have to then work for the rest of his 11 months? No. The moment you die, he's a free man and all contracts cease to be in effect that you agreed on his behalf. وَلَهُ إِنْتِزَاعُ مَالِهِ, and you are allowed to take his wealth. He's going to come to this in a while. A slave's wealth belongs to a slave, but it's not a full form of ownership. It's a form of ownership that can be counteracted by the owner of that slave, which was something that was not usually done because it's not the default. The default, as he mentions later, is that a slave's property belongs to him. But if a person sells that slave, there's a slightly different issue here, because people then might be buying the slave purely to get the slave's money. So in those circumstances, the property belonging to that slave actually remains with the original owner unless it's specified by the... And there are conditions that, when you want to do a valuation, for example, if I in this thing we were talking about, if I make a slave a mudabbar here, and then I die, and this slave that I made a mudabbar has wealth of his own, how do you work out the value of this slave in terms of working out the third? Plus the value of his property. Yeah. So say for example, when I die, I have this slave who I've made mudabbar and I have 400 dinars. Yeah. This slave is worth 100 dinars and his property that he has his hands on is worth 100 dinars. What happens? The total value of everything, including that slave who was freed, is 600 dinars. So a third of that is 200. So the slave goes free and takes his money with him. That's what happens in that circumstance. Let's say another circumstance where I die, I leave 100 dinars. That slave is worth 100 dinars and he has 100 dinars to his name when I die. So the principle here is the money goes with the slave unless it's specified or removed. So now the value of that slave is 2/3 of the entire amount, because it's 100 plus the 100 for the... So what happens in this circumstance? No, because the wasiyah can only be a third. And the tadbir is considered to be part of the third. So what happens in this circumstance is 50% of the slave is freed. and he takes the money with him. Because that 100 is considered part of the value of the slave. So in those circumstances, the slave is now half freed, which means that half of the slave's time is his own and half of the slave is for the heirs, the inheritors. But they can't touch his money because it has gone with the slave and it's all the slaves. So this would simply mean that one day would belong to them, one day would belong to himself in those circumstances. And it would limit the types of things. For example, if this was a female slave, they wouldn't be allowed to sleep with that slave. Yeah. What half are sleeping with? ثم لا يجوز له بيع وله خدمته وله انتزاع ماله ما لم يمرض, so long as he has not entered into his final illness. So if the owner made a slave a mudabbar and this slave had wealth of his own, and then after he fell ill, he knew the slave was a rich man, he went to say, look, I'm taking your money from you. He's not allowed to do that anymore, because the slave is now part of what belongs to his heirs rather than purely himself. He does not have full right of disposal over this slave anymore. It's not his. And also the slave is freed at the point of his death, so he does not have any right of disposal over what's in the hands of that slave after he's fallen ill. وَلَهُ وَطْءُهَا إِنْ كَانَتْ أَمَةً. But if the slave that he made mudabbar is a mudabbara, is female, a female slave, then he is allowed to continue to have intercourse with her. Why? Because she's still his until the moment he dies. And also it might be in her own benefit, because if she falls pregnant at his hands, her child is free, and she is freed upon the moment of his death, regardless of whether the third is enough for her or not. She's freed before anything. Before any of his estate is worked out, she's freed. Because an walad, which is usually translated as a woman who is given birth to a child at the hands of the owner, but actually simply means anyone who's actually fallen pregnant at the hands of the owner. She is freed the moment he dies, automatically, regardless of how many debts he's got, regardless of how big his third is or anything. She's free, and her child is free. Her child is free the moment the child's born. So, I mean, obviously this was, I suppose, an encouragement for slave women to have relations with their owners, given some of the positive things for them that could arise. وَلَا يَطَأُ الْمُعْتَقَ إِلَى أَجَلٍ. Now we have another type of free slave that is freed, which was, so they would do this thing, you are free on my death, but they would do something else. You are free. You work hard for me for the next 10 years and you're free at the end of that period, for example. They might say something like that. Or, you've been a great slave to me. Come, I will free you at the beginning of 2025. You deserve it, or whatever it is, That was an example that you have a set date upon which that slave is freed. This slave, again, is not considered to be part of the third anymore. So if I say this, I'm going to free this slave woman, you're free in 2030, and then I die before that, then she's not considered to be property because she's on her way to becoming free. So she's outside of my estate. She's not freed immediately. She's freed on the date, so she could continue to give service to the heirs, but she's not freed immediately, and she's not part of the property that can be divided up amongst herself, I suppose, unless you assign a value to the service that she might continue to give. And you cannot sleep with her. Why as an owner can't you sleep with her, do you think? Once you've said you're free in 2030. Because for example, if you sleep with her for one and make her pregnant, that doesn't give her any additional benefit. Really. Because she's going to be freed regardless.
Just a quick one.
And also it's the same as before we finish that, it's the same as talaq, as nikah mut'a. basically, because what you are doing in a temporary marriage is allowing yourself to have sexual relations with a woman for a temporary period of time, and you're not allowed to have a contract whereby you have sexual relations with somebody for a temporary period of time. So if you freed a woman specifically on a date in the future, and that's going to come to an end, then you know the sexual period of time that you can have relations with her is limited by time. And so you're not allowed to do that. See what we're going to ask?
No. I'm thinking slave woman to a man. You said she's automatically freed once she's had a child, yeah?
At his hand, not if she has a child with somebody else.
No, but
Yes.
so she's freed automatically. But if she
No, but she's not freed on the spot. She's freed upon his death.
Okay. But what if she didn't have a child?
Yeah.
She's not free at all.
No, she's not. She remains property, which is inherited by his heirs, unless he freed her in any of these other ways. So slaves were.
So if his son inherits her,
Yeah.
would he be able to have sexual intercourse
No.
with her?
Not if she had sexual intercourse with her father. There's similar conditions attached to the relationships when it comes to slave women as to wives. So if a woman had been married to your father, you cannot then marry her. Similarly, if a slave woman had slept with your father, you cannot sleep with her. It's the same prohibition. وَلَا يَطَعُ الْمُعْتَقَ إِلَى أَجَلٍ. Somebody who is being freed he may not have sexual intercourse with her if she's been freed on a specific date in the future. وَلَا يَبِيعُهَا, and he's not allowed to sell her. وَلَا هُوَ أَنْ يَسْتَخْدِمَهَا, and he's allowed to make use of her as a servant, as a slave, in all of the other ways apart from sexual intercourse, while she continues to be in his possession. Because obviously, if you didn't free her now, but freed her at some point in the future, you want to get something out of that, which is her usage as the slave. وَلَهُ أَنْ يَنْتَزِعَ مَالَهَا, and he's allowed to take her money from her, مَا لَمْ يَقْرُبُ الْأَجَلِ, so long as it's not close to the end, to that period where he freed her. So if it's like within a month of her being free, he's not allowed to touch her money anymore. But if, for example, you did it for 10 years in the future, then she has the same status as a slave in every respect, apart from him being allowed to sleep with her until the final months. So everything that you're allowed to do with the slave, you're allowed to do with her until that final month, apart from sleeping with her. وَإِذَا مَاتَ فَالْمُدَبَّرْ مِنْ ثُلُثِهِ, and if he then dies, the mudabbar, the person who's freed upon his death, you are free the moment I die, is taken from the third. وَالْمُعْتَقْ إِلَى أَجَلٍ مِنْ رَأْسِ مَالِهِ, and the one who is freed on a specific date in the future is taken from his wealth as a whole. In other words, it's taken before anything else is considered or calculated. Well, kitaba, so I'll just do a tiny bit of this last one. Oh no, we'll finish there. We'll finish here because the kitaba is quite a long section. So is there any questions here? I know this is something that's not actually something that we have much experience about in the modern era. I mean, you do have a lot of people who have relationships with women outside of marriage, but that's got nothing to do with owning them anymore. That's to do with something else entirely. But freeing of the slaves was an important thing to know because it was one of the main ways of drawing near to Allah. So a lot of energy was taken in making it clear to people that they knew how to do this. We're going to come to it later. There are other times when the Qadi forces through the freeing of a slave because of shortcomings on the part of the owner or other factors. So we'll finish there inshallah. Bismillah wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladhina an'amta alayhim ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Amin. Allahumma salli ala sayyidina Muhammadin abdika wa rasulika an-nabiyyi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam taslima. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursalin. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Assalamu alaikum. See you next time inshallah.